Welcome back to another episode of Gamma 20. We're studying the book of Genesis, going through the last half, why the beginning matters. Today, we're going to look at study 18, Isaac and his sons, Genesis chapter 23 to 26. Let's start with a word of prayer. Father, Lord, we ask, oh Lord, this time that you open up our eyes to what faith looks like in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and his sons. We ask for Jesus' sake. Amen. Right, so Genesis chapter 23 is a chapter that focuses basically on the purchase of the first piece of the promised land. The whole chapter is actually dominated by Abraham's purchase of the promised land. Sarah dies, Sarah is buried, and 16 verses are dedicated to this land purchase. And this is in fulfillment of the covenant in Genesis chapter 12, where God will give him great land, great nation, and a good blessing. And actually, when you come to a land, he couldn't really get the land or have any rights to any land simply, or even buy the land, because he's a sojourner and foreigner among the people who are the Canaanites at that time, the Hittites. Okay, so basically, what they've done is that the wife has died, and Abraham needs to be able to bury her. Okay, and he says, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me a property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, saying, Here is, my Lord, you are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you this tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. So they actually offer him, because of the respect as he worshiped God, at that time there, you are a prince of God, a free gift of the land. But Abraham rejected this offer, and he actually offered to buy it. And the price for which he buys it is actually quite expensive, 400 shekels. When Jeremiah was offered a field, it was 17 shekels. David bought the temple site for 50 shekels. Omri in Samaria was 6,000 shekels, but relatively expensive piece of land here. And the money that's given to him to buy this land actually was given by Abimelech 25 years ago as compensation, because he mistakenly took Sarah to be his concubine or his wife, and then God afflicted him, and so therefore he gave him 1,000 pieces of silver, which more than makes up for this amount to buy this particular piece of land. So the land is located in modern Hebron, right in the middle of Israel, the field of Ephron or Machpelah, which was the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout the whole area was made over to Abraham as a possession. Verse 23, if you look down there, the field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for burying place. All right, so therefore this is Abraham's first ownership of this promised land which God has given him. And if you go to Israel today, it's commemorated by a building, right? So if you look back at the covenant formula, you've got election where he is chosen and given the covenant. He lives righteously under the conditions of the covenant in obedience, and God actually fulfills his covenant promises, and this is the first part of the fulfillment. It's the burial land, right? But he actually doesn't really inherit the promise in his lifetime. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, Hebrews, and a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him in the same promise. So right up to this particular time where his wife actually died, she never stayed in the house. They never owned a piece of land on which they live. They live now they died, and Sarah died and is now buried in this first piece of land, which is actually purchase. And this expensive cost is actually reflective of one day the high moral cost which Abraham and Israel will pay for staying in this land in terms of following God's commands. Now, Genesis chapter 4 is about a bride for Isaac. It's not about dating and how to get a wife. All right, it's more important than it's about how we actually live our lives, and how marriage is part of that kind of life that we will live. And there are 3 points that we can see here and take home. One, we need to align our lives, how we live, with his calling. Can't just live any way we like. We need to feel for his hand, how he moves in our lives, and we need to trust his purposes in our lives. So we need to align our lives with his calling first. So there are 4 scenes here. One in Canaan with Abraham and his servant, where he commissions him. Second one is Mesopotamia, the servant at the well. And Mesopotamia 2, where the servant and Laban and his household. And number 3, the return, where Isaac, Rebekah, and the servant, verses 62 to 67. All right? Okay? All right? Now, here we actually remind us, Genesis 12 is covenant, 13 is the land promised, 15 and 17, reiteration of the promise and expansion. It will be a land and a nation. In Genesis chapter 22, there will be a blessing to all the nations as well, multiple nations as well. So the promise, Isaac was born, Genesis 21, fulfillment of the promise after 25 years. Abraham was 100 years of age. So you can see that God acts in small movements, actually fulfilling the promise after 25 years. So therefore, we can see that God moves slowly, and therefore we must recognize the calling even though you can't see it. It is all by faith. All right? So Abraham was well advanced in age, old. The Lord had blessed him many things, and the Lord said to his servant, the oldest of his household, had charge of all that he had, put your hand on my thigh, that I might make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not take a wife from my son, from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I live, but will go to my country, to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. So here he commissions a servant, but he does it in line with the purposes of the covenant. He has to send the servant 400 miles to the north, dangerous remote location, bandits along the way, he could have been killed. It is a sacrifice. He has to rely on others. It will be a difficult journey. Why does he do this? Why can't he marry the girls around? There are plenty of Hittite girls. In fact, pragmatism is the antithesis of all that spirit-led. Proverbs says there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is death. So the most convenient way may not necessarily be the right way, because he's aligning his life according to his calling. All right? Now, you look at what he says. Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed him in all things. The blessing of God to Abraham in all his life gives him a rich experience upon which he can then base future decisions. So therefore, he will not take a daughter-in-law from the Canaanites, right? Okay? And the servants said to him, perhaps a woman may not be willing to follow me into this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said, see to it that you do not take my son there. So he's saying that the son is a son of the covenant. He stays within the covenantal land. He does not leave the covenantal land. If the woman doesn't want to come, that's too bad. You don't bring the son there. All right? The Lord God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give you this land. See, what he is doing is that this insistence of his son staying within the promised land, insistence of his son not marrying women from the Canaanites here, was to align his life with his calling. Marriage is not just about marrying any woman who likes you back in return. It is about aligning your life with his calling. So therefore, the Lord God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and swore to me, to your offspring I will give you this land. He will send an angel before you. You will take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you must be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. And so, why couldn't he marry the girl next door? Well, the success of this enterprise depended on the separateness of God's people. A necessary condition. If they want to develop a counterculture where his people will walk with God, they must reflect this culture. So therefore, he cannot marry into the culture of the girl next door, as it were. Right? So I will bless those who bless you, and in him who him who dishonors you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Isaiah says, I will make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach the end of the earth. So therefore, the son, his people, his family have a special calling, because it is through Abraham and his progeny that this world, all the families will be blessed, and they have to be different. They have to be the light. They have to show the people how they walk with God. Right? So if you look at this particular thing, you can actually see 3 elements that we need to take home. God's promises, God's deeds, and God's purposes. So he bases his decision on God's promises. This is a God who spoke to me and swore to me to your offspring, I will give you this land. So therefore, it's about the land, it's about God's promises, which is why he actually does what he does. So therefore, he's basically on the foundation of God's promises. And it's also based on God's deeds. The Lord God of heaven, who took me from my father's house way back in Mesopotamia and Ur, and from the land. All right, so therefore, I know this promise is going to work out because this is what God has done. He actually brought me very safely, hundreds of miles across from Mesopotamia to this place called Canaan. And then there's a purpose there. He will send his angels before you. You shall take a wife for my son from there. So this is entirely God's promises, God's deeds, and God's purposes, which is therefore on Abraham's side, because God promises, he must trust, because God has done to him what he has promised in his past, he has experienced on it, and this gives him the comfort and the assurance that the trust is not misplaced, and then this is God's purpose, which means I will be obedient. And in these three things, upon these three things is our entire Christian faith, where we trust God in his promises, we've experienced his help, his salvation in our life, and therefore we will be obedient to his calling and align our lives. This is very important, right? So if the woman is not willing to follow you, you must not take my son back there. So a life of faith always involves placing it all online. There is a risk. All right. Contrast this with Isaac's son later on, ungodly Esau. Right? Ungodly Esau knew that the father and mother had sent Jacob out to his home country to find a wife, and not a wife among the Hittites. But what he did was, he was 40 years old when he took Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemet, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. So they took two women, not one, two. And they're both Hittites. They're people of the same culture, of which they could be contaminated with in a life that doesn't honor God. And the result, you can see, they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. So you can see how Esau is untethered to God's calling. Now, if you look at marriage today, if you look at Pew Research, says marriage is very unpopular, it's almost obsolete. 39% of people do not actually believe in marriage, and we can see the statistics from 1960 to 2008. There is a plummeting number of people who are actually married, 52% versus 27% who are actually unmarried. Why do people get married? Right? Is it because of a feeling of this love? Well, there's an interesting study by a book written by Georgetown professor and psychiatrist Daniel Lieberman and lecturer Michael E. Long. And they actually say the prime mover of human behavior is a particular molecule. They call it a molecule of more that actually drives all our behavior. And this is actually none other than dopamine. And dopamine is a chemical of desire that always asks for more stuff, more stimulation, more surprises. It's not having that matters, it's getting something, anything that's new, that actually stimulates us. And basically that's why people jump into marriage, because of this chemical of desire. He describes this as having a carousel or merry-go-round at the bottom of a bridge. And this is what Daniel Lieberman writes. He says, a carousel will take you round and round on a fun trip as many times as you like, but it will always leave you where you have begun. Each time the music stops, your feet are back on the ground, you must make a choice. You take one more whirl, or you cross the bridge to the other side, a more enduring kind of love. In that realm, across the bridge, attachment, your love is driven not just by dopamine buzz, but by deciding to appreciate someone in the here and now, and day after day. So he's saying there's two kinds of love. There's a kind of love that is like a buzz, where you fulfill your dopamine buzz and you live for that high, this woman, and then you divorce her, then there's another woman, but you always wind up at the same spot. Or you can move on to a more matured love and go across the bridge, and that love is based on a decision. And in our faith, it's a decision that aligns with our calling. In fact, psychologist FRANKL actually writes, happiness, or this buzz, cannot be pursued, it must ensue. You must have a reason to be happy. It's a very pursuit of happiness that thwarts happiness. So therefore, if your desire to get married to a particular woman is basically a desire for happiness and it's a pursuit of happiness, it will actually be counterproductive. Because if you look here, good things happen and bad things happen. They always will attenuate to a baseline of happiness. You can never remain in one spot or the other for a very long time. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and that was not enough, which means he's doing the carousel round and round, always winding up the same spot and not actually forming a proper attachment and growing in his decision to love. All right, now when you look at the end of the chapter where Isaac gets his wife, you can see there's a process here. Look at the sequence. He went out to meditate in the field, then he lifted up his eyes, he saw and behold the camels coming, and the servant of Isaac told Isaac all the things that he had done, which was all the courting procedures, how God had guided him. He told him everything, how this is in God's will. And then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his wife, and he took Rebekah, which means sexual intercourse, and then in that act she became his wife, and then he loved her. Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So look at the sequence. The love actually comes last. The decision to marry is according to God's will and all that's been related. That comes first. She became his wife and then he loved her. It wasn't the modern day the Romeo and Juliet love at first sight kind of becomes the basis of the marriage. It is not. Look at the sequence. All right, so love is a decision, it is a judgment, it is a promise. If love is only a feeling, there would be no basis for the promise to love each other forever. A feeling comes, it may go. How I can judge that it will stay forever when my act does not involve judgment and decision? This is Eric Fromm, a social psychologist, and he's actually right, because love has to be a decision, because a decision will stay forever, whereas a feeling is fleeting. All right, so important things that our decisions that we make as a believer needs to align with our calling, which means if we are called as a people of God, if we are called as people of God to live in obedience to God, so therefore marrying someone who shares that same calling, that same goal is actually crucial. All right, you can't say, look, I'll marry a non-Christian or someone who doesn't follow our God, because it doesn't align with our calling. And the first insistence, even to the detriment of the whole enterprise, was Abraham insisting that it must be someone who will align with his call. All right, so second thing is that not only we must align our lives with his calling, we must feel for his hand in our lives. This is the looking at the servant, how he uses and walks along the path that takes God's guidance. He utilizes culture and wisdom. He doesn't stand there and says, abracadabra, God, let's pop this woman in front of me. He doesn't do that. Christian guidance isn't like that. God doesn't make that woman miraculously appear before your eyes. He uses custom and he uses culture and wisdom. So he took 10 camels. Why 10 camels? Because you give these camels as a gift. And he takes all sorts of choice gifts from his master. That's part of the custom at that particular time. All right, so maybe you come from a Chinese culture where they used to give the xiuqi or whatever dowry as part of the custom. Well, that's part of the custom and the culture, and he has no problem using that. He arose, went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor, and he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of the water at the time of evening, the time when women came out to draw water. Now, he doesn't go in the middle of the night. He doesn't go early, early in the morning. He goes at a time when women come out to draw water, which means he uses wisdom to go where the women are. And then he prays. He puts it to the Lord. He says, "Oh Lord, the God of my master, Abraham, please grant me success today and show faithful, steadfast love to my master Abraham. And behold, I'm standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who will say, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed to your servant Isaac, and by this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master." So here, he is actually putting the whole endeavor by faith and praying, asking God, because Abraham is aligning his choice with God's calling, and so therefore he's got God into this enterprise. Show faithful love. And not only that, he's using common sense. He goes to a place, he doesn't go in front of a boys' school and look for a woman, right? He goes in front where young women actually congregate. And he says, the one that he's going to be actually thinking about and praying about would be the one that says, I will not only give you something to drink, which is kind, but I also water your camels. And this is a big thing. You know why? Because every camel will drink 25 gallons of water. Every bucket holds 3 gallons of water, which means this poor girl will have to draw 83 buckets of water for the 10 camels. Now, maybe most of you will draw 1 bucket for a stranger, but would you draw 83 buckets? That's a lot of things. And actually it aligns, the godly wisdom was the characteristic of an excellent wife. And this is Proverbs 31. She dresses herself with strength, makes her arm strong, the 83 buckets. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable, her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff and her hands hold the spindle. She's sewing. She opens her hands to the poor and reaches her hands to the needy. So this is a woman not only strong, all right, she's also kind. She's also caring. She also looks out for the poor and reaches her hands to the needy. Strength and dignity are her clothing. She laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her heart. So therefore, you've got to be kind if you're going to, use your strength to pull out 83 buckets of water. Charm is deceitful. It is not just based on looks. Beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. And before he finished speaking, Rebekah, born of Bethuel, son of Milcah, wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, which is a relative, came out with a water jar on her shoulder, and the young woman was very attractive. So here, not only is she within Abraham's tribe, she's also beautiful. A maiden who's also a virgin whom no man had known. So this suddenly appears before him. And, after giving him a drink, she said, I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking. It means all 83 buckets. She emptied her jar into the trough and ran to the water to draw water. And she drew for all, remember, all his camels, all 10 camels, 83 buckets. That's a lot of things. So therefore, as she was running back and forth to do this, the man gazed at her in silence to learn whether God has prospered his journey or not. So therefore, he doesn't jump to conclusion. As he's doing that, he's meditating. He's discerning whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. So once the camels had finished drinking, the man took the gold ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets on her arm weighing more than 10 shekels of gold. And he said, please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for her to spend the night? So therefore he senses this is God's hand. Once he senses, because he put certain criteria and the woman had fulfilled this criteria by being kind and strong and diligent, then he basically asks her. He makes his move. And she said, I am the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. And she added, we have plenty of both straw and fodder and room to spend the night. Here he has a woman who is full of Mediterranean, Eastern hospitality, not only kind and hardworking, and what do you know? Daughter of Bethuel, which is basically a relative. All right? And the man bowed his head, worshipped the Lord. They said, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master. Abraham has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness towards my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman. This is very important. He didn't know that this girl was actually a relative of Abraham. Imagine of all the people, thousand people in the city of Nahor, in the land up there, he had come right across to that very well where this young woman is there. All right, and if you can see, she's a relative to Abraham, given rise to Isaac. His brother Nahor, had given Milcah, basically, and then through Bethuel, basically, had formed Rebekah. So Rebekah is actually Isaac's niece, right back from the family of Terah, not a Hittite woman. So this is not a coincidence. There are no coincidences when God is involved. And when they get married, they will produce Jacob and Esau, and this is where the whole 12 tribes of Israel will come into being. And you can see how God works back in time to secure his promises. God lays the background to his promises if only we will have faith to trust his life for us. Now, the next step is not only that, you have to go and confirm whether the father will allow them to marry. So the brother. So Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran out towards the man in the spring. As soon as he saw the ring and bracelets on his sister's arms and heard the word of Rebekah to his sister, the man spoke to me. He went to the man. Behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring, and he said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside? For I prepared house and place for the camels." And then the servant relates his process of how he actually came to meet Rebekah, right? And he describes the whole thing. And then he's not presumptuous. Yeah, he says, "I bowed my head, I worshiped the Lord and blessed the Lord, God of my master Abraham, who led me to the right by the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. And now that if you're going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me, if not, tell me that I may turn to the right hand or to the left." So here, even though the servant is more or less convinced that this is God's process, he left it to God, he prayed, he stepped up by faith, and he went to this random well, and of all places, God leads him to this particular young lady. He's not presumptuous. If you are going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, which means if you're going to say yes, tell me, if not, tell me that I may go somewhere else. So it waits for confirmation. And Laban, which is the brother of Rebekah, and the father Bethuel confirms. He says, when they actually heard the miraculous circumstances under which this random servant travels all these hundreds of miles and actually meets the daughter and their sister, it must be from God, isn't it? So Laban and Bethuel answered, "The thing has come from the Lord." They declared, "We cannot speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go. Let her be the wife of your master as the Lord has spoken." There's a word there, "We cannot speak to you bad or good." That actually is the same Hebrew word as Genesis chapter 3:5. God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing bad or good or evil. Which means it's a term that actually is saying that this decision is the prerogative of God. So you can't eat the fruit of the Garden of Garden of Eden, fruit of knowledge of good and evil, because once you take it, what you have done is you've decided what is good and what is bad. And so therefore, when Bethuel and Laban heard about how these things had come from the Lord, how of all the people they chose this young lady, they've decided this comes from God. So therefore, we don't have a right to say it is a good thing or a bad thing. So therefore, they left it to the Lord. All right? So, and then Rebekah gets the recognition of the call and obedience. So let's call the young woman. They now, not only that, they've got confirmation of the circumstances which the servant has done. He prayed before the Lord. Lord brought him Rebekah. The father and the brother have said, "This is the one." Now they go to Rebekah. They're not forcing this. Let's call the young woman and ask her. And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" And amazingly, she said, "I will go." All right? She's been related, the servant is related to her all about Abraham's calling and the son. And this is Rebekah's choice is much like that of Abraham 50 years earlier. They're told to leave and go to an unknown land just on a promise. He hears about this wonderful God and his wonderful blessings, to be part of a new nation. You can't see the future, but she makes a choice by faith with a man she had barely known and met 24 hours earlier. And she said, "I will go." And this is nothing other than divine guidance. And others finally confirmed this. They blessed Rebekah and said, "Oh sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him," which means victorious. So here we look at the decision-making process in this particular episode. The decision fits into the overall direction of God's call in our lives, rejecting other alternatives. The servant committed the endeavor to God in prayer. He established certain criteria in wisdom and commensurate with the call, stepped out in faith, and looked for confirmatory signs and responses. This is how we make our decisions, aligning our lives to the will of God, whether in marriage or in business and in so many areas of our lives. Finally, Not only we have to align our lives with His call, feel for His hand. This is how His hand works in our lives, and we are to trust His purposes in our life. And here we have Isaac probably meditating in the field. Isaac had returned from Beer-lahai and was dwelling in Negeb. Isaac went out to meditate in the field towards the evening, and he lifted up his eyes and saw, behold, there were camels coming. Right? What was he thinking? He was thinking, look, this is, he's not in control. The servant's calling the shots. He's not the one doing the choosing. And he's already 37 years of age. What if his servant was unsuccessful? What would she be like? Would she be fat, thin, ugly, whatever? And then are there a local, or maybe he's got a love interest who is the girl next door, a Hittite woman, right? We don't know. And he's thinking about his father's vision for him. And then here we have an almost hallmark moment. All right? Isaac went out to meditate. He lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, the camels are coming. The lady was there. Rebecca lifted up her eyes and she saw Isaac. She dismounted from the camel. Lifted her eyes is like a hallmark moment, telling you that, God takes a long time, 37 years. But God is never, ever late. He's got His purposes, and it turned out to be a good thing. So God works through seemingly precarious efforts of man. There's so many what-ifs. Abraham made a decision. I'm not going to have my son marry the local ladies. Their culture is completely different. We need to make up our minds and our mandate that we have to align our lives to the calling that God has given for us, no matter what the cost. That is the trigger point. The servant's wisdom and faithfulness made the journey smooth. Laban and Bethuel gave consent. Rebecca actually had the faith to believe and say she will go. Isaac had the patience and wait to trust. And all these, any one of these could have come apart. Laban and Bethuel could have been disobedient. Rebecca could have said no. Isaac could have had an affair with a young lady across the road. Any of these things look as if God's plan can fall apart, isn't it? But God works it all together for His purposes. It's like looking at a bunch of strings at the back, right, of a picture made from stitching. And you can see all the different threads. You don't know where it goes. But if you look on the other side of the tapestry of life, you can see a beautiful picture. This is what we see. We don't seem to be able to figure it out. But as long as we are faithful like Abraham and decide to align our lives to the calling of God, then it will turn out to be a beautiful tapestry. That is the picture of our lives, to honor and glorify God. Right? And the conviction of the call that drives Abraham, he says, He will send His angels before you and you will take a wife for my son. All right? Abraham, final picture by Abraham, he died at 175 years of age, old man, full of years, gathered to his people, and he lived a life based on a promise, because Hebrews says by faith he went to live in the land of promise, in a foreign land, living in tents. He never received the promise, the fulfillment. He only had as a place where he was buried together with his wife. So Hebrews 13 says, people of faith, they all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them, greeted them from afar. See, a life of faith is a life of vision. It's a life of a calling. The life that believes there's more to this life than what I can see, or feel, or touch. And so therefore, in that sense, when we live, we're like strangers and exiles on earth. The rest of the people live on earth only depend on their dopamine and what they feel. We live life based on a promise, right? Lastly, Genesis chapter 25. It's a section about what happens later on. Abraham, with the death of his wife, married, took another wife, Keturah, okay, and these were the sons and daughters that he actually had. And he dies at the age of 175, buried together with his wife, all right? And look here, these are the generations of Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, the wife, conceived. Genesis 25, verse 26, Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Here you can actually see, again, despite God's promises, Isaac had to wait 20 years to have his child. Again, it seems to be that in this family, infertility runs. God has to choose. Why does God have to choose an infertile man all the time? It's Abraham the problem with Sarah, Isaac a problem with Rebecca. What are the odds? All right? But he has to wait 60 years. He had 60 years when he actually bore a son. All right? So God's sovereignty does not imply human passivity. We're not just sit down and do nothing. Abraham actually had to send his servant out. Recipients of God's promises does not necessarily have a smooth time. They get to persevere in severe trials. The importance of persistence of prayer. He prayed over the last 20 years to have a child before you get a child. And God works his promises actually through our choices in the end. This is Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, and he actually brought out this idea that we can actually utilize the power of prayer. The power of prayer is that we actually visualize what we want. You unleash untapped energies using the prayer by faith, giving thanks to the Lord. I'm going to believe you that I'm going to get a Lamborghini or Maserati or Mercedes-Benz, and then they will release the power of heaven. It solves problems, strengthens personalities, improves health, greatly enhances the chances of success of any kind of endeavor, which means prayer is then used as a magic wand to get what we actually want. It's called positive confession, passed down to people like Robert Schuller, Kenneth Copeland, Kenneth Hagin, this idea of positive confession. In fact, the Singaporean Joseph Prince ministry turned it into what we call the key of the house of David. I will lay on his shoulders, he shall open, no one shall shut, and he shall shut and no one shall open. The visual image that God gives us is the key of David. God wants you to know that Jesus will use this key to open doors and blessings and provision for you this year, as it goes on. So here is actually what happens is that you're using prayer in a way where you can demand. Instead of you aligning yourself into God's will, God is to align his life, and whatever he does according to your will because of the power of faith, where we put faith first rather than God's purposes first, right? But this is not how it's supposed to be. And there's a prophecy when Rebecca actually is with children, the children struggle within her, and she said, if it is thus, why is it happening to her? She's wondering, if I'm a woman of the covenant and I'm having these twins, after 20 years, I'm going to get babies. Why are they fighting all the time inside? She began to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples are from within you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger. And this is prophetic. It tells her very clearly the struggle of the 2 fetuses is emblematic of the struggle of 2 peoples within them, because there will be 2 children and they will have differences. The one will be stronger than the other. The older will serve the younger, and that's completely different, because in the culture of the Middle East is primogeniture. Everything goes to the oldest. He will be the alpha male. He will be the one through whom all the property in the name of the father will go. Here is a complete overturn. All right? Romans chapter 9 verses 11 to 13, Paul writes that though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purposes of election might continue, not because of works, because of him who called. For she was old, she was told, the older will serve the younger, as is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. So therefore, Paul is saying that in life, whichever path you take actually is not up to you alone. It is up to God's purpose of the election, because the example is Jacob and Esau, where God chooses one and does not choose the other when they actually have no merit, because they both have no track record. They're both just fetuses. And God shows us through this that God's choices, he chooses a barren woman rather than a fertile woman. He chooses a younger brother rather than an older brother. He chooses failures rather than successes, to show us that human wisdom is actually useless. Paul writes, for God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast before the presence of God. So salvation is never by human effort. The unmistakable proof of his power is the fact that he chooses contrary to what we think. And the person he chooses is Jacob. And the Hebrew word for Jacob or Jacob is actually a supplanter, a selfish, self-orientated person. Of all the choices, I don't know why God has to choose the lesser of the two twins, the one who's actually a malignant, deceptive person. Right? Esau understands this later on when you actually have him cheated of his birthright, cheated of his blessing. And Esau says, is he not rightly named Jacob? Because the word Jacob is a selfish, self-orientated supplanter, a schemer, a deceiver, a con man. Actually, God's promise went through a con man. Right? And you can see, compare the two, the description of Noah, when God chose him. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And just chapter 27, Esau said, is he not rightly named Jacob? He cheated me 2 times. And this is true. Right? He doesn't deserve to be chosen. And yet God chose him. It's like God choosing this fellow. Right? And breaking him down. Right? Amazing. So, and you can see Jacob's story is a story of transformation. And because God chose him, his life was changed. That's why when he actually wrestled with God in Genesis chapter 32, he said to him, what is your name? And he had to say, I am a supplanter, I'm a deceiver, I'm a con man. That's it. Jacob knew what his life was. And then God said to him, your name will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. So I mean, this is how God chooses someone and chooses all of us, no matter how bad we are, in order to transform us. And there are 2 twins, emblematic of the people of the world. One impetuous, ill-disciplined, short-sighted, no EQ. The other was scheming, sophisticated, manipulative, morally corrupt. All right, and God chooses one rather than the other. And if you look at Esau, why God didn't choose him? Well, because he didn't want God. Jacob said to me, sell me your birthright right now. Esau said, I'm about to die, so what use is it to birthright to me? So Jacob said, swear to me now. And he swore to him and sold the birthright to Jacob. Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil soup, and he ate it and drank it and rose up and went his way. Esau despised his birthright. So when Jacob was cooking his minestrone soup, it was so beautiful, it's so tasty, that Jacob actually sold it to Esau, who was very hungry after a hunt for his birthright, which means Esau despised his birthright, that he gave it up for a measly bowl of bread and lentil soup. That is the short-sighted kind of person Esau was, who will never be the kind of person that will actually be transformed into the new nation. All right? But it's his choice. His short-sighted choice. And later on, it says in Hebrews, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. But no one is sexually immoral or unholy. So Esau is described as unholy, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterwards, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. So this is a man who actually focused on immediate gratification, who has got no inkling or no desire or sensitivity to the things of God. He treated it dismissively. He didn't value it. And that's his choice. And that should not be the choice of us. We should see the calling of God, the blessing of God, as the most important thing of our lives, and not sell it for a single meal. But the temptation for all of us is to sell our birthright, our desire to be part of His covenant people for not a single meal, for just a series of meals to live for the here and now, rather than living by faith like Abraham for what a city that we cannot see, whose building and foundation is built on the power of and vision of God. That Esau is completely opposite. He is a man of the world, and he's given to us as an example of the choices that we make will align with God's sovereign will. May God add a blessing to His word.